There is a document sitting in a museum in Istanbul, drawn on gazelle skin parchment, stained with centuries of handling, creased along ancient folds, partially damaged at its edges. It was created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, one of the most knowledgeable navigators of his age, and it shows Antarctica, not approximately, not in the vague mythological way that ancient maps sometimes depicted a theoretical southern landmass. It shows Antarctica with specific recognizable geographic features, a coastline, mountain ranges, bays, and peninsulas in roughly the correct positions. The problem that has driven cartographic scholars to spend careers trying to explain it, is that Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. That is 307 years after Piri Reis drew his map. 3 centuries after his pen moved across that gazelle skin, European explorers would sail into southern waters and announce to the world that a frozen continent existed at the bottom of the earth. And yet, there it is, on a map made in 1513. This is not fringe history. This is a documented, studied, debated question in the academic literature of cartographic history, a question that has generated serious scholarly attention for decades and has never been fully, satisfyingly resolved. What you are about to hear is the honest version of this story, not sensationalized, not dismissed. The version that acknowledges what is genuinely strange, what remains genuinely unexplained, and what the evidence actually says when you follow it carefully and refuse to look away. Part 1. Who was Piri Reis? Before you can understand what his map means, you need to understand who Piri Reis was. He was not a crank, not an eccentric mystic working from dreams and prophecy. He was a professional navigator, a naval commander, a man whose life was organized around the practical demands of sea travel in one of the most powerful maritime empires in the world. His full name was Haji Muhyiddin Piri ibn Haji Mehmed, born around 1470 in the Ottoman city of Gallipoli, into a family with deep roots in naval life. His uncle, Kemal Reis, was one of the most celebrated corsair commanders in the Mediterranean, a man whose tactical knowledge was legendary. Piri Reis learned navigation at his uncle's side from childhood. He understood winds, currents, the behavior of coastlines at different seasons, the practical geometry of sea routes in ways that only come from years on water. But he was also an intellectual. He collected maps, not casually, but systematically, building a library of cartographic materials from every source he could access. When he created his world map in 1513, he documented his sources explicitly. He said he had consulted approximately 20 source maps, including maps from Portuguese discoveries in the New World, ancient maps from the classical period, and, most intriguingly, what he described as a map drawn by Christopher Columbus himself, based on his westward voyages, that had somehow made its way into Ottoman hands. The Piri Reis map was not a work of imagination. It was a synthesis, a careful assembly of cartographic knowledge from multiple sources, produced by a man professionally equipped to evaluate what he was working with. And that is exactly what makes what it shows so difficult to explain away. The Piri Reis map is a fragment. The original, if it was ever complete, would have been a world map. What survives is roughly the western portion, the Atlantic Ocean, the eastern coastlines of the Americas, the western coasts of Europe and Africa, and along the bottom, a landmass. That lower landmass is the source of everything. It runs along the southern edge of the map in a continuous mass of land, stretching east to west in a position and at a scale that corresponds, at least roughly, to a southern polar continent. It has a coastline that is not smooth and approximate in the way that invented or speculative landmasses usually appear on old maps, where the cartographer was guessing, filling in space with something plausible. It has specific geographic features, indentations, headlands, what appear to be mountain ranges rendered in the conventional style of the period. The details are not random. They are not decorative. They look like the representation of a place that someone, at some point, actually observed and recorded. The American researcher Charles Hapgood, a professor of the history of science at Keene State College in New Hampshire, published a detailed analysis of the Piri Reis map in 1966 in a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Hapgood's argument was methodical and specific. He compared the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map against the actual topography of Antarctica as revealed by modern geophysical surveys. Surveys that had used seismic equipment to map the Antarctic landmass beneath its ice sheet, the rock surface that has been buried under kilometers of ice for thousands of years. His conclusion was extraordinary. The southern landmass on the Piri Reis map corresponded more closely to the sub-ice topography of Antarctica than to its modern ice-covered surface. In other words, the map appeared to show Antarctica as it would have looked before it was covered in ice, before the Ice Age reached the continent, when it was a temperate landmass with exposed rock and visible mountain ranges and coastlines that could be seen and measured and recorded. If Hapgood was right, and this is a significant if, the map was not just 300 years too early, it was thousands of years too early. One of the most technically compelling aspects of Hapgood's analysis was not about Antarctica specifically. It was about the mathematical structure of the map itself, about the projection that Piri Reis used when he assembled his sources into a unified image. Map projections are mathematical systems for representing the curved surface of the Earth on a flat surface. Different projections encode different geometric choices and produce different patterns of distortion. Identifying which projection underlies a historical map is one of the most powerful tools available to cartographic historians, because it tells you something about the mathematical knowledge available to whoever created the original source material. Hapgood and his colleagues analyzed the geometric structure of the Piri Reis map and concluded that the underlying projection was consistent with a system that places the projection center, the mathematical point from which the map radiates outward, somewhere in the region of Egypt or the Eastern Mediterranean. This is not, in itself, unusual. What is unusual is the accuracy of the long-range geometry, the proportional relationships between land masses separated by thousands of kilometers, the relative positions of Africa, South America, and the southern continent, are correct in ways that, as researchers found with the Portolan charts of the Mediterranean, should not have been achievable with the navigational and mathematical tools of the early 16th century. The pattern is the same one that haunts the Portolan charts: excellent large-scale accuracy, poor small-scale local detail, the fingerprint of copying, the trace of a source that was mathematically sophisticated in ways the copyist did not fully understand or could not fully reproduce. Piri Reis was not inventing, he was assembling. And what he was assembling came from somewhere that understood the geometry of the Earth with a precision that 1513 Ottoman cartography had no independent means of achieving. It would be dishonest to present this story without engaging seriously with the criticism. And there is serious criticism. Professional cartographers and historians have pushed back on Hapgood's conclusions with arguments that deserve attention. The most fundamental objection is one of identification. How do we know the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map is Antarctica? Old maps routinely included a theoretical southern continent, a landmass that classical and medieval geographic tradition called Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. This was not based on observation. It was based on the ancient Greek philosophical argument that the Earth's landmasses must be roughly symmetrical, that the large landmasses of the northern hemisphere required a corresponding mass in the south to keep the planet balanced. Many cartographers included a southern continent on their maps, for this reason alone, with no observational basis whatsoever. Critics argue that the Piri Reis southern landmass is simply a version of this conventional Terra Australis, a standard cartographic feature, not an observation of a real continent. They point out that other maps of the same period include similar southern landmasses, and that the similarities between the Piri Reis coastline and the actual Antarctic coastline can be explained by the flexibility of comparison, that motivated pattern matching can find correspondence between almost any irregular line and a complex coastline. These are not trivial objections. They are the careful, methodologically sound skepticism that good historical scholarship requires. But they cannot entirely account for the specificity of what Hapgood documented: the mountain ranges in approximately the right positions, the structural similarities to the actual Antarctic coast, the sub-ice topography correspondence that goes beyond what a philosophical guess should produce. Here is where the story connects to the deeper mystery, the same mystery that underlies the Portolan charts, the same question that Roel Nicolai's geodetic analysis of medieval Mediterranean charts raised without fully answering. Piri Reis did not claim to have discovered Antarctica. He did not claim to have sailed there. He stated explicitly in annotations he wrote on the map itself that he was compiling from sources. He named some of those sources. He referenced ancient maps, maps that he described as being of great age, maps that had passed through multiple hands before reaching him, maps whose origins he did not fully know. The question is not whether Piri Reis knew about Antarctica personally. He almost certainly did not. The question is whether among the ancient sources he was copying from, there was a map that showed a southern continent, a map made at a time when Antarctica was observable, when its coastline was not yet buried under the ice sheet that has covered it for millennia. This connects to what cartographic historians have found when they analyze the portolan charts of the Mediterranean. Those charts, the nautical maps that appeared in 1275 with accuracy equivalent to 19th century standards, also encode geographic knowledge that their supposed creators could not have produced. They also appear to be copies of ancient sources. They also show a pattern of long-range accuracy combined with short-range imprecision that is the mathematical signature of reproduction, rather than original observation. When Scott Loomer analyzed 26 portolan charts and found that all of them matched the Mercator projection, a mathematical system not formalized until 1569, he was documenting the same phenomenon that the Piri Reis map represents. Ancient knowledge, preserved in copies that outlasted the civilization that originally produced it, transmitted through chains of reproduction whose intermediate links have mostly been lost, arriving in the hands of medieval and Renaissance cartographers who used it without fully understanding what they had. Piri Reis was a link in that chain. His map is a window into something older. If the Piri Reis map preserves genuine knowledge of Antarctica, if there is a real observational basis for the southern continent it depicts, then someone observed Antarctica before the ice covered it. That observation had to have been made, recorded, and preserved through a chain of copying that eventually reached an Ottoman admiral in Istanbul in 1513. The geological evidence is reasonably clear on timing. The Antarctic ice sheet began forming approximately 34 million years ago. The last time significant portions of Antarctica's coastline were exposed and observable as a temperate landmass, when a ship could have sailed along the coast and mapped what it saw, was deep in geological prehistory, long before any human civilization we have documented. This is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable for conventional historical frameworks. Because if the knowledge encoded in the Piri Reis map is real, if it is not coincidence, not false pattern matching, not simply the conventional Terra Australis tradition accidentally resembling reality, then it implies a chain of geographic knowledge stretching back to a time before any civilization we know of was capable of oceanic navigation and precise cartography. It implies people who possess seafaring capability and mathematical sophistication thousands of years before the civilizations we call ancient. That implication is why serious scholars are both drawn to this map and deeply cautious about it. The evidence is real, the implications are vast, and the gap between what the evidence shows and what it would require us to accept about human history is enormous. The most academically conservative explanation follows the same trail as the explanation for the portolan charts. It points to Byzantium, to Constantinople, to the libraries the Byzantine Empire maintained through the centuries when Western Europe lost access to the accumulated geographic knowledge of classical antiquity. The Byzantines preserved Ptolemy. They preserved geographic treatises whose originals had been lost in the West. They had access to navigational knowledge from trade routes stretching from Britain to China. And they had deep contact with the Italian merchant cities, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, whose cartographers produced the portolan charts. When Constantinople fell to Ottoman conquest in 1453, 60 years before Piri Reis drew his map, the scholarly contents of Byzantine libraries dispersed. Some was destroyed. Some went west with refugee scholars, feeding the Renaissance with rediscovered classical knowledge. And some remained in Ottoman hands, available to an admiral with a passion for maps, who was building a cartographic library and compiling everything he could find. The southern continent on the Piri Reis map may be a Byzantine inheritance, an ancient map preserved in a Byzantine library, copied generation after generation from an original that showed a coastline reel at the time of its creation, transmitted through centuries until it reached Piri Reis, in a form he could use but whose origins he could not explain. This is speculation, but it is the kind that honest scholarship produces when it follows the evidence to the edge of what is known and acknowledges that the edge is not the end. There is a quality to the Piri Reis map that makes it different from most historical mysteries. Most mysteries are mysteries of absence. We are trying to explain why a record was lost, why a civilization disappeared. The Piri Reis map is a mystery of presence. The evidence is there. The map exists. The southern continent is drawn on it. The question is not whether it exists, but what it means. What chain of knowledge produced it? What civilization stood at the beginning of that chain? What understanding of the earth they possessed? The honest answer, the one the evidence supports, is that we do not know. Hapgood's analysis remains contested. The identification of the southern landmass as Antarctica, rather than conventional Terra Australis, is disputed. The sub-ice topography correspondence is striking, but not universally accepted. The projection analysis is suggestive, but not definitive. What is not contested is that the map exists, that it shows something in the south, that Piri Reis compiled it from ancient sources he could not fully identify, that the cartographic tradition he worked within, the same tradition that produced the Portolan charts with their impossible medieval accuracy, consistently encodes geographic knowledge beyond what its supposed creators could have achieved. The map Piri Reis drew on gazelle skin in 1513 is sitting in Istanbul right now. You can see high-resolution images of it online. You can trace the coastline of the southern continent and compare it to modern maps of Antarctica. And you can ask the question that everyone who looks at this map eventually asks: who first knew where Antarctica was? When did they know it? And what else did they know that we have not yet found? If this story has unsettled you, if you found yourself leaning toward the screen, if the question of who first mapped that southern coastline is still turning in your mind, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. We don't do easy answers here. We don't do sensationalism, and we don't do dismissal either. What we do is follow the evidence, honestly, all the way to the edge of what is known, and then stand there and report back on what the view looks like. Every week there is a new story, a new gap in the official record, a new piece of evidence that doesn't fit the timeline we were taught. The Piri Reis map is one. The Portolan charts are another. There are dozens more waiting. Subscribe now so you don't miss them. Hit the bell. And if you know someone who thinks history is a settled subject, a closed book, a finished conversation, share this video with them. Because the map is still there. The questions are still open, and the most interesting chapters of human history may be the ones we haven't written yet. Disclaimer: this video has been created solely for educational and informational purposes, educational and documentary. The content is based on an analysis of historical hypotheses and private research, in particular the works of R. Nicolai, which may differ from generally accepted scientific data. We do not claim that the theories presented are definitively true and encourage open scientific discussion. All materials are used under fair use for critical analysis and commentary. The author does not condone misinformation and recommends that viewers consult peer-reviewed scientific publications to obtain a complete picture.